So hi everyone, this is a talk which is prepared for the Understanding Honeybees and Beekeeping workshops at Walworth Garden. And this video of it, which we're recording, is intended for the volunteers who help manage the apiary at Walworth Garden, not for any other participants really. So my name is Simon, I'm the Apiary Manager at Walworth Garden, and we're going to talk about the honeybee, its life cycle and keeping bees. So this is an overview of what we're going to talk about. So we'll start with the honeybee, the life of the honeybee colony. And then we'll go on to the principles of urban beekeeping, including in London. We'll talk about tools of the trade and a practical inspection of the hives at Walworth Garden Apiary. So some of those later sections are not for this talk, but we'll get as far as we can. The picture on the right is of Walworth Garden, of us in the apiary, I think in the summer of 2021, busy looking at the bees in the corner there. And there's a little bee in the bottom of the presentation. This bee progresses along the talk as we go through. So you get a rough idea of how far we are through the overall presentation. So when we have the workshop proper, we're going to have an interactive presentation in the morning about the honeybee and the colony and the basic principles of beekeeping in London. Have some lunch and chat over lunch, and then we'll split into two groups in the afternoon, have a practical inspection of the hives and talk about the tools of the trade that we need. And then we'll finish with some simple beekeeping procedures and a quiz and where you can get more resources. And I think this is me in the picture here, inspecting the hive last summer, full hive there. So we're cover this morning, we're going to talk about bees, the individual honeybee, the life cycle of the honeybee, the colony, which is really the organism, as I'll say. We'll talk about pollination, beekeeping, and the London bee situation. That's just the title slide. So the big idea behind beekeeping really is what's good for the bee is good for the colony and good for all of us. So you've got here beekeeping. Bees are a social insect. An individual bee can't live by itself. It needs to have a queen, thousands of workers and hundreds of drones, all living, doing the right roles. And that's a little bit like us as humans. We don't live by ourselves. We live in communities, we do different things. And I think beekeeping as well, particularly the way we do it at Walworth Garden, is very much a social activity. And social is as important as anything else, I think. So what makes a honeybee and not a bumblebee, an ant or a wasp? So this is a little bit of the background to bees here. So they're in the family called Hymenoptera, which means to do with their wings, which are clear, and I've forgotten what the word is now. Anyway, it's to do with the wings. And you've got three families within that, which is the wasps, the bees, and the ants. They're all closely related. And wasps came first, and bees came later. And that's very significant in the evolution of wasps and bees, because bees evolved at the same time as flowers, because wasps are meat eaters, and they like to eat all sorts of other insects and so on. But bees are vegetarian, they only eat pollen and nectar. So when the flowers came along with pollen, the bees realized, some wasps actually realized that they could eat pollen instead of other insects as a protein source, and started to co-evolve with flowers doing so. And that evolutionary trail led to bees, of which there are three basic types. They're solitary bees, bumblebees, and honeybees. And we'll talk a bit about that in a minute, I think. So how many types of bee are there? 20,000 or more different types of bee worldwide. Around 270 types in Britain. And of those 270 types, 25 bumblebees, 1 honeybee, and the rest are solitary bees. And the pictures on the right here are from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, which is a great charity, great organization, showing how to identify some of the most common 8 bumblebees, which are seen in our gardens and roundabout. And you should be able to identify most of those in London, I think. Maybe not the Heath bumblebee, but the other ones I think you'll find in London. And bumblebees in particular are adapted towards cooler climates. That's why they're so fat and hairy. So if there's a lot of global warming, then the bumblebees will probably suffer because they tend not to live in very hot climates. So here's another chart about differences between honeybees and bumblebees and wasps. And you see the three columns for honeybee, bumblebee, wasp. So honeybees look like bumblebees, but are smaller. Bumblebees are fatter and hairier. And wasps are very variable in appearance, but importantly, they're not hairy. Honeybees eat pollen and nectar from open flowers. They have short tongues. Bumblebees have different lengths of tongues. So some can feed on plants with deep nectaries, and some on ones with shallow. But wasps eat other insects and fruit and so on. Honeybees lives in hives, as we know. Bumblebees in nests, 50 to a few hundreds, and wasps live in nests. But we'll talk about that in a minute. The queen and the daughters in a honeybee hive live the whole year round, but in bumblebees, only the queen hibernates somewhere warm in the ground. And similarly in wasps, the nest dies, but the queen hibernates over the winter. The honeybee builds sheets of wax comb hanging vertically. The bumblebee sometimes builds some sort of comb and nest, but they live sometimes some in the soil, some in the trees, some in attics and wherever. And wasps build papery combs. Only the honeybee makes surplus honey to eat over the winter, because it's the only one of these insects which survives as a colony during the winter. The bumblebees only make enough honey to eat during the year, and the wasps only bring food back to the nest for the queen and the larvae to eat. So subtle differences between the three things there. But it means if you see a wasp in the late summer and feel like killing it, you don't need to, because it's going to die anyway, unless it's the queen. Further comparisons between the two bees and the wasps. You can see the honeybee is weakened by the varroa mite. It's becoming attacked by the Asian hornet, which is moving into this country now, poisoned by pesticides, and it's declining mainly in rural areas, not in urban areas, and that's due to pesticide use. Bumblebees, on the other hand, are struggling much more. That's due to the loss of habitat, loss of forage, and pesticides. And I'm not sure we know very much about wasps, but some of the rarer ones are certainly struggling. Only worker honeybees sting, and they have an acidic venom. Bumblebees can sting more than once, as can wasps, and the wasp venom is alkaline. So you put bicarbonate of soda on a honeybee sting, but vinegar on a wasp sting, so I'm told. The honeybees have developed this communication called a waggle dance, which you'll know about, and we'll talk a little bit more about. But bumblebees are not known to communicate between workers. So you can see the honeybee is a special insect, very social, and it's developed quite a lot of traits which distinguish it from other bees and wasps. The subspecies of honeybee we have in Britain is Apis mellifera mellifera. Apis is the genus name for honeybees. And you can see there are other subspecies of Apis mellifera in other parts of Europe. And they've developed because the bees in those areas have been there long enough to develop distinct subspecies versus the ones we have here. Now, I think I attended a very interesting lecture a couple of weeks ago by a German researcher, and he was saying that the majority of honeybees now are kept in managed colonies, so in boxes, if you like, that beekeepers manage, rather than living in the wild. And that has very significant consequences for their continued evolution, because an animal living in the wild will evolve according to Darwinian principles. Natural selection will be very prevalent. But as we keep them in boxes and we treat them in certain ways, those natural selection processes are interrupted. So it's quite concerning what we're doing with honeybees and what impact we're having by being now the dominant manager of this wild species, the honeybee. That's something to ponder and maybe chat about later. Now we're going to move on to the individual honeybee, and you can see that the bee here has moved on a bit further through the bottom of the slide. This is a picture, I think it's from the Encyclopedia Britannica of a beautiful picture of a female worker honeybee. We're going to look at an image, a drawing with the part's name, but I think it's a beautiful picture to see the three pairs of legs, the pollen baskets, the wings, and so on, and how it's hairy on the body. So here's that same honeybee, but labeled. So all insects in the adult phase have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. They have three sections to their body. So the honeybees are the same, and all insects have three pairs of legs. So 1, 2, 3. You can see they have a compound eye here, which allows them to see light and movement in particular, and some color. And they have 3, I think it is, ocelli eyes, which detect the light and they're able to see where the sun is, and they use that for navigation. They have antennae here, which are used for feeling their way and for smelling. They have mandibles, jaws, which they can chew stuff, but they eat through a tongue, a proboscis here, which is of relatively short length. And you can see that the abdomen is divided into a number of sections, and each of them has a spiracle. Those are little air holes. That's how the bee breathes, through holes in the side, which leads into a thing called hemolymph, which has got hemoglobin-like substance in it, which absorbs oxygen. And you can see it's got a stinger here at the end, which is a modified sexual organs. 2 pairs of wings. All honeybees have 2 pairs of wings. Wasps similarly have 2 pairs of wings, bumblebees 2, but flies only have 1 pair of wings. That's how you can tell the difference. And you see the legs are jointed, foreleg, middle leg, hind leg, and they've got specialist activities like an antenna cleaner on the foreleg and a pollen press in the hind leg, where they'll compact the pollen as they're harvesting it to bring home to the nest. So what do honeybees see? This is a spectrum going from infrared to ultraviolet. And as we learned, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet is the colors in Britain. And those who went to school in Britain will probably know Richard of York gained battle in vain, which is how we remember the order of the colors. Anyway, long wavelengths here on the infrared side, that's the sort of warm light, and the ultraviolet, the cold light, is here with short wavelengths. Visible light is what we see, which is here. You can see the humans. Bees have a shifted color spectrum that they could see. They can't see red, and they're good at seeing blue. So when you see lots of red flowers, honeybees don't see that red. And if you want to go and see honeybees at night, then using a red light means they don't see it. But they are very good at seeing blue and ultraviolet, which means what they see on flowers is not the same as what we see. And you can see pictures of that to show that there are almost designs on the flowers which lead them to where the nectaries are. And here's that picture of the honeybee again. It's so good I wanted to show it twice. Absolutely beautiful insect. And now I think we'll move on to the colony of honeybees, the worker, the queen, and the drones. When these are all in the hive, I think you'll agree they look pretty similar, and it's not always easy to see the queen or to see the drones. But when you see them here, you can see the differences. So the honeybee worker is about 14 millimeters long, and the wings reach just about the end of the abdomen, and the abdomen is relatively straight-sided. Excuse me. The queen, on the other hand, has got a much longer abdomen because that's where all the eggs are, and the wings look quite short, don't they? And it's the long abdomen, sometimes a different color, that distinguishes the queen. And also, as I think you know from the inspections we've done, the different behavior of the queen. She scurries about the hive in a different way to the workers. And the drone here looks very different, doesn't it? Fat. It's the male bee. Its sole role really is to mate with queens from other hives, and there'll be hundreds of the drones there in summer. But all it does is mate with other queens and eat the honey which the workers bring in. But the presence of drones in the hive seems to be necessary for the hive to feel orderly, as it should be. If you take the drones away, then the hives don't seem to like it. So there's more, seems to be more drones than there need to be, but that's presumably for a reason. Now we're going to go on to the life cycle, and understanding the life cycle of the honeybee is absolutely critical to keeping bees, because what goes on and how it goes on and when it goes on is important to what we need to do through the year. This is a picture from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's the best one I could find of the life cycle of, this is of a worker. So you can see the queen on the left-hand side here laying the egg. She lays the eggs at the bottom of the cell, singly, one per cell. If the eggs are laid down the side or multiple eggs in the cell, there's something wrong. And that egg, after 3 days, developed into a larva, and that's a 6-day larva. And you can see it's curled around nicely, it's white, it's segmented, and that's as it should be. After 10 days, the cell is sealed and the larva starts to turn into a pupa, or sometimes called a chrysalis. But eventually, after day 21, the pupa turns into an adult worker bee, and the worker bee eats its way out, and you can see the bees being born, and we've seen that in the hives. Typically, the queen in the summer at peak laying is laying 1,000 or 2,000 eggs per day, and so a bee is being born, every minute, really. That's why we see them so readily when we're inspecting the hives. That's a nice illustration of what goes on inside the cells. Now, this looks a bit complicated, but it's important to think about the difference between workers, drones, and queens, because they have different development phases. They all go through egg, larva, pupa, adult, or egg, caterpillar, chrysalis, adult, if you want to use other names for it. And they all spend 3 days as an egg. And in order, the queen will lay a worker egg or a drone egg. If the workers think they need to have another queen, they will feed the emerging larva with queen jelly, royal jelly, and that larva will turn into a queen larva and will develop here in 16 days as a queen. If it's a worker egg, it will spend 3 days as an egg, another 6 days as unsealed brood, and then 12 days as sealed brood and come out after 21 days. And a drone will come out after 24 days. We'll talk about Varroa at a later talk, but this longer stage in the sealed brood is why Varroa mites favor drone brood, because they can put in one extra cycle of breeding in the drone brood, and so there's twice as many of the Varroa mites when the drone comes out as there are with a worker bee. So I see the queen here spends 9 days from day 4 to day 9 as sealed brood, as unsealed brood, and then day 10 to day 16 is sealed. Now, so when you see a queen cell in your hive, it's probably, you're seeing it at day 7 or 8 or 9. And in order to intercept that queen before it emerges and then creates a swarm, you need then to inspect the hive within a week. So if you, in the summer, when the swarming season is on, it's very important to be inspecting at least every 7 to 9 days, so that you don't allow a queen cell to go from being sealed to emerging, or you'll have a swarm on your hands, and that's pretty impossible to stop. So that's an important slide, and the timings are important. And this is a review of it, and there's a way you remember the worker ones here. So they all spend 3 days as an egg. The worker spends 6 days as a larva, which is twice the 3, so 2 3s are 6. Then the worker spends 12 days as a pupa, so 2 times 6 is 12. So 3, double 3, double 6, ends you with 21. And then you just have to remember the queen does it quicker, and the drone does it slower. And that's an important thing to know for when you're managing your bees. And here's now some pictures of the honeybee brood. We've seen play cups. So nobody really knows why play cups are laid as they are, because they're not really queen cells, but it seems to be that the worker bees are just trying things out. but a queen cell looks like a peanut hanging down from the comb, quite often in the corners and the bottom here, as you can see, queen cells here. Worker and drone cells are laid horizontally, whereas the queen cells are laid vertically. And once you get queen cells, then unless you do something, you will have swarms. So we talked about these play cups. So we call them play cups because we're pretending that bees aren't serious about swarming. That's a bit of a joke, really, because they probably are. Then it becomes a longer one, and they put royal jelly in. And if you see that, then you know that they're serious about swarming if they haven't already swarmed. So before dealing with the queen cell, it's very important to know whether your old queen is still there or not. I know many beekeepers who've killed off the queen cells in the hive, then gone to look for the existing queen and find there isn't one. And so there's no queen to lay new eggs, and there's no eggs that can be turned into queen larvae, and then the hive dies because they just can't create another queen. So this is a tricky time for beekeepers. If there's a neat hole at the bottom of the queen cell, that means that the queen has emerged normally, and you've got a new queen or a princess if she hasn't yet mated. But if the queen cell is empty and it's torn at the side, it means that the queen cell was killed by another queen, probably, because normally the first queen to emerge will kill all the other queen cells in there, so she will have the right of carrying on her genes. So this is to show you an egg. So if you look in that red circle there, there's one egg at the bottom of the cell. In the green here, you can see one cell with 3 eggs, I think it is, in there, which is very unusual. And then you can see the larvae here, which are looking good in the purple cell, C-shaped, segmented, and pearly white, which is what you want to see for healthy brood. And always remember those 3 things: C-shaped, segmented, pearly white. Now we'll move on to colony structure and organization. Yeah, I think we'll just do this piece before taking a pause. There's a division of labor within the hive as to what each of these bees does. And you can see the queen, the worker, and the worker, queen, and drone here from the side. They look where you get a different view of their differences. The workers are all sterile females. They're all daughters of the queen. And they essentially do all the work. They bring in pollen and nectar, which we call forage. They bring in propolis, which is tree resin, which is used to gum things up and glue things together. And they bring in water. They don't store water in the hive, but they bring it in, and they evaporate water from the nectar they have as well. So water management is an important task. There are house bees. So that's the flying bees. Then there are house bees, which guard the hive, clean the cells, build the comb, nurse the larvae, remove dead bees. They're called undertaker bees. They tend the queen, get the nectar from foragers, and propolize cracks to make the hive safe. So worker bees live for 6 to 8 weeks in the summer and about 6 months in the winter. And in the summer, the first 3 weeks of their lives will be spent as house bees, and they go through a succession, as I'll show you, of doing different tasks, and then they'll become flying bee for the last 3 weeks, and they presumably die of exhaustion after that. The queen is the mother of the colony. Her job is only to lay eggs and then to swarm later. She can typically live 4 to 6 years, so quite long-lived. And the drones are the males. They're the sons of the queen. They don't have a stinger, so if you get a drone bee, you can play games with that with people because it won't sting them. It mates with queens from other colonies, spreads the colony's genes, and they live for a few months but die before the winter. They're actually pushed out by the workers at the end of the summer because they're no longer needed. They have no function after they've mated with other queens. And the queen can't, if a queen mates in September, it won't have a chance to build a colony that will survive the winter. So that's a division of labor by caste, as it's called, of bee. And this is then the career progression for the worker bees. And you can see it's roughly 3 weeks per phase for a worker bee. 3 weeks as an immature bee, from egg, larva, prepupa and pupa. 3 weeks as a hive bee, when it's going on from cleaning, pollen management, feeding other larvae, feeding the queen. And then 3 weeks as a field bee, when it's doing things like or some bees actually stay in the hive for longer, actually, and they do things like guarding and wax secretion and comb building and so on, and nectar ripening, which means getting rid of the excess water, and the foraging bees collecting nectar, pollen, propolis, and water. And it seems to be that bees that collect pollen only collect pollen, and bees that collect nectar will only collect nectar. So the two types of bee in the hive are hive bees, house bees, and field bees or flying bees or foraging bees. And that becomes important later on in how we manage our colonies. This then looks at the change of numbers of honeybees in a colony through the year. So you've got January to December, and the purple line is the number of adults, and you can see wintertime around 10,000, and then it peaks up, rapidly peaks up to about 50,000, and starts to decline again. The brood, there's almost no brood, no larvae at all in November, December, early January, and that's why we do the Varroa treatment with the oxalic acid in December when there's no brood, because you want all the cells to be open so that the oxalic acid can kill off the mites. And you see how the numbers of brood increase and the numbers of adults follows the brood. So you're getting a honey flow in May and another honey flow in July. And this used to be called the June gap, when there weren't so many nectaring flowering plants in June. That's less so in London now, because we have so many different plants that flower throughout the year from February through to November that there isn't really a gap in nectar availability through the summer. So many beekeepers will take 2 honey harvests during the year, with the main one being in July. So now we'll come on to swarming, and this is a swarm of bees on an aeroplane. And swarming is the method of reproduction. So you start off with 1 colony of bees, you end up with 2. And it's a way of reproducing and spreading the genes. So it's a very natural process, shouldn't cause alarm. And swarms are generally very docile. They don't have a home to defend. They don't have stores of food to defend, and they don't have brood to defend. So when you see those pictures of a man or a woman now completely covered by bees, that is normally a swarm of bees that's landed, that they've encouraged to go onto that individual. But they can settle in inconvenient or hazardous locations and cause a lot of trouble. People panic when they see a swarm, and it is a scary sight, because you've got perhaps 20, 30,000 bees there, and being stung by 20 or 30,000 bees will be pretty unpleasant and probably fatal. But they're very docile. And the thing to do if you see a swarm is to call a swarm collector via the British Beekeeping Association website. And the London beekeepers have quite a few people who collect swarms in London. These are just some more pictures of swarms from last year, I think, that people submitted to the WhatsApp group. And you can see these swarms have settled probably quite close to the original hive, 50 yards or so away, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. And the swarm, which contains the old queen, will settle there, and scout bees will be sent out to look for a new permanent home and come back, and they'll agree amongst themselves where the permanent home is. Then after a few hours or a day, they'll fly to their new home. And now we've got pictures of a swarm from Walworth Garden from, I think, the year before last, maybe last year, I can't remember actually. So you see quite a lot of bees there, and then later, so it's only minutes later, very short, but that swarm has now settled on that branch. It's got much bigger, and that's where it rested. That's where we tried to catch the swarm from. We weren't very successful with the swarm. It flew off in the end. It wasn't a very big swarm either. Oh, I don't want to do that. This is how you collect a swarm, and I'll show you the video, and then I'll explain what happens. We can watch it again if necessary. So it's rather magical to watch a swarm being collected. What the swarm collector will do is to, you typically have a cardboard box or a bucket or some sort of container, and he'll hold this under the swarm of bees, normally on a tree or wherever it is, and then shake or knock the branch where the bees are on, depending on how it's situated, but knock it. And most of the bees will generally fall into the bucket or box at that point. You then turn the box upside down onto a white sheet. And as long as you've got the queen in the box, all the other bees will walk into the box. They'll fly down and they'll just walk in, doing exactly what these ones are doing here. You see they're just quite peacefully walking into the box because the queen's in there. They can smell the queen. They just want to find a new home. So that's all they're doing. So normally you would leave that upturned box with a brick underneath it so that there's a space for the bees to climb in, to get in. Leave it there overnight, so all the flying bees which are out will come in overnight. Come back when it's dark. Tie the sheet up around the box, and put it in the boot of your car and drive off to wherever you want to take it, or take it on public transport if you want to, or whatever you need to do. But as long as it's secure, you can get that swarm then to a new location. Now we're going to talk briefly about pollination. And when you see bees doing this type of dance, so that this bee is going around in circles and it's waggling its tail and pointing in a certain direction, that's indicating that it's found some good nectar sources, and is telling the other bees where it is relative to the sun and so on. On the right hand side here, you've got bees fanning, and they're giving out a pheromone which tells the other bees this is home and this is where they need to go to as a new home or its existing home. So people have done a lot of work to decode the waggle dance, and this is the beehive, and you've got 3 different forage sites, 1, 2, and 3, relative to the sun. And if depending on the location of those sites relative to the beehive and relative to the sun, the bee will do the dance in different directions. So here you can see it's going around figure 8 in that way. Here it's going the opposite way, and here it's tilted at an angle differently. It takes quite a long time to decode that, but it's possible to do so, and studies have actually decoded that and found out where the bees have gone to, and verified that with following the bees. So how and why do bees do that? Well, they need pollen to feed the young larvae, and they carry that from one plant to another as they search for food. And they need the nectar to feed themselves, keep themselves going through the winter. So to make a jar of honey, honeybees may visit 2 million flowers, fly something like 85,000 kilometers. And to make half a kilo of wax or honey needs 8 liters of nectar. As you can see, these numbers start to get very big. So an ordinary colony, not even a big one, needs about 50 kilos of pollen and 200 kilos of nectar every year. And that's not to store any excess, that's just to survive. And then the colony will need another 25 kilograms of honey just to survive the winter. So you can see honeybees need a lot of nectar, a lot of pollen to survive, which is why there's worries about them outcompeting wild bees, because there's so many of them, and they're such good foragers for pollen and nectar. Bees are very effective pollinators of flowers and crops, not just honeybees, but also bumblebees. Tomatoes, for example, are pollinated by bumblebees and not by honeybees. So people get the idea that only honeybees do do the pollination. That's not true. Honeybees are actually, they pollinate more flowers than most other bees, more plants, I should say. But because of the way they store pollen on their pollen baskets on their legs, they're rather selfish in keeping it to themselves and bringing it back to the hive. Bumblebees are very hairy and they carry lots of pollen on their hairy bodies, and that means they're not collecting the pollen for themselves very much. So that just gets spread from flower to flower. So food crops, fruit trees, cotton plants for clothes, plants that are fed to animals that produce our dairy and meat. So that's a lot of, so if no pollination, no dairy and meat. The trees that we grow for timber to build houses with, etc., as well as wildflowers, so of course important for biodiversity. So it's not just the crops we eat, it's the clothes, the animals, the trees, the flowers, really quite important parts of the ecosystem. And here is another illustration of that. I'm not sure how you calculate 82 million pounds, but you can see examples here of how much food is pollination dependent. 500 million pounds a year. And unlike wild pollinators, honeybees are moved to areas where crops are flowering, particularly in the United States. So for the almond harvest and the citrus harvest, they move tens of thousands of colonies of honeybees to the almond trees, pollinate those for a couple of weeks, and then move them somewhere else. Not a very sustainable practice, I'm sure. And as I said, the bumblebees can be used to pollinate tomatoes and polytunnels and so on. I think I'm going to take a stop there. We've got 45 slides in, so excuse me. I'm going to